Leading Teams Through DevOps with Kevin LaBranche.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company empowering software delivery and helping .NET teams just absolutely be world-class through its ClearMeasure way for effective software teams. A quick announcement, my architect forums are still going strong. Signups for the next session are up. And if you are a lead architect, if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate and learn from other peer architect leaders, then just go ahead and sign up at the link in the show notes. And for those of you who are looking for my video podcast, Programming with Palermo, just go ahead and search in any of the podcast directories or on YouTube and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is Kevin LaBranche, and he's a software developer who finds great joy in teaching and learning from others. He's been honing his craft for over 2.5 decades, and when not in code, he's near it. And he's often working on practices and processes that improve the engineering excellence of the team. Currently, Kevin is in an architecture and lead development position at Northern Arizona University. He develops best practices tailored to the team and company culture, and he's a strong believer in applying systems thinking to all he does. Kevin, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Oh, good. Thank you for having me, Jeffrey. Kind of a dream come true for me. I've followed your work for a long time.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Well, you and I have known each other for a number of years now, and actually you've participated on the architect forums and contributed really valuable insights there. And I wanted to get you on here because you are currently leading a software organization there at Northern Arizona University. And over the years, you've changed the way that organization works. But before we get into that, kind of back up a little bit. I always like to ask the guests what landed them in this type of role. But what are the significant events that you remember in your career that kind of steered you in along the path that you've landed in?
Fabulous question. I don't think I took any kind of crazy path from a lot of people. The thing that I discovered, I went to actually where I'm going to work now. I is my alma mater, so Northern Arizona University. I got my degree here. Funny thing was I was really bad at math, so I did not do the computer science and engineering track as a major. I did the computer information systems instead, which is a business degree, but with enough credits that you don't need a minor because your emphasis. And I picked up computer science as a minor because I knew I wanted to do software development. But let me put it this way: mathematically proving something happened in order log n notation killed me. Yeah. But I survived. I knew at an early stage I enjoyed working with the end users. I enjoyed business software, writing business software. And so even before I graduated, I was working full time for the county and had a really amazing human leadership manager. And funny enough, started actually in COBOL for about 6 months before he looked at me and said, what's the newer tech?
Yeah.
And I said, this is some of the newer tech. And he says, tell you what, I'm unleashing you to the newer tech.
Nice.
I had actually had a couple semesters of training. I was one of the last few students to get training in COBOL at NAU. A few years later, they retired it. But he definitely saw that I had a lot of other talents. And so I helped usher us into modern client server back then. We're talking Windows NT and all that stuff, and doing software development there. And he was an amazing human being, amazing teacher around people skills, people management, all those things. He always said, it's not if, it's when you're going to make a mistake. So he says, build that relationship with your customers and it'll go a lot smoother. And so that really launched me into a lot about my career, way more about the human side of it than the technical side of it. And actually, I've said over my nearly 2.5 decades thereabout in the business is that never had an actual technical mentor. A lot, the internet was where, and book reading and all those things, but I never had a person over me who was mentoring me. So a lot of that I had to cut my teeth. And my desire was, man, if I could help someone else a little bit farther down the line, a little bit sooner in their career than I was, where can they be when they get to where I am? So that's really led me. And so even at the county, I ended up taking positions where I was in leadership, leading teams, leading criminal justice integration project that actually was a pilot project. We won awards. And it was funny, back in the day, it was something called message passing and using cues. And I remember even thinking back then, almost 15-ish years ago, maybe more than that now, probably about 20, like, this seems silly. And here we are all these years later, and it's everywhere, message passing, cues, all those things. So I didn't even realize the ideas of that, what we were coming forth then. And it's just part of the growth that anyone has. And I came to NEU nearly 12 years ago, almost. I actually stepped down from a leadership position where I was leading all developers, all business analysts, all, back then they were called webmasters, and third party as well as custom. Came to NEU in a senior role, and have slowly over here now I'm part of the architecture team. And I've always found throughout my entire career was helping others. And so I never touted myself as the better developer or the best developer. I've always found people on my staff who could, sometimes code circles around me, but there were skills like teaching, writing, training, all these things that a lot of times they would run away from. They either didn't have it or didn't want it. And I always found myself gravitating towards that. So in my architecture role, a lot of times I find myself, there's plenty of technical, but it's a lot about what's our culture. How do we fit what we're doing in our culture? Best practices, you've got to adjust to your culture. You've got to adjust to your realities. And so that's where I've been probably for, I would say easily the last, for sure, 5-7 years here at NAU, but I've been doing it through my entire career.
Yeah. Nice. Well, you guys and your teams are using modern automated DevOps practices and more cloud services. But when you started there, I don't know how far you want to back up, just to give us an idea of the progression. What did it look like when you started, or when you started working on the changes?
Well, yeah, that's good. I mean, because honestly, we were all the way when it was TFS and TFS version control back in the day. I actually came from Mercurial land when I joined the team. I loved Mercurial. I found its simplicity, but Git won the war. So very quickly, TFS went into DevOps, the name change, and Git. And so when we started making that shift, and I joined this team about 7 years ago, about halfway through my journey here, we went through an ITS merger. We were decentralized and centralized. And so the leadership at that time created one big ITS org and merged all software development teams. Now, there are many teams in the team, but I joined we say it's the pure custom dev team, because we have PeopleSoft developers, and that's got its own ecosystem. We've got Salesforce developers with its own ecosystem. Anyway, so it was in that journey, because in that time, there was no DevOps. In fact, a lot of it was right-click deploy in Visual Studio. If it wasn't that, it was literally putting in a ticket with the system administration team with exact instructions with a zip file. And you can just imagine the mistakes that occurred time and time again, and the delays. We could take months to stand up a new website. That was the beginning of our journey when really we went from TFS to when it switched over to DevOps and Git. We started that journey very basically. It was wild, wild west, drag and drop, classic GUI, YAML wasn't even around then. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. It was just get it working, get it out the door. And so we've slowly morphed over time. We have build scripts now, allows us to at least know that how it's done locally is the same on the server. we have a lot to go still, even with, really reaching like what is true CI. We do encourage trunk-based development with very short-lived feature branches. But we still have cases where a developer just feels very uncomfortable in that arena, and they'll have a branch, living for months. And I just work with them. I coach them. I teach them feature toggles. I do all these kinds of techniques, and I let them kind of also discover it. I've been very careful to be, like that architecture astronaut that we've all heard about. In times past, they just tell you this is the way to do it, but they're out of touch. And so really like to get in, show them, let them play with it, and then find out later on when they were like, aha, I got it. I'm like, yes, when you have that eureka moment, you won't go back. And you can't force a eureka moment. A lot of times it's them getting enough tutoring, getting enough mentoring, getting enough support, and then the light bulb will eventually switch. And so one of the things in our CI journey that we're still grappling with our group is a lot of idea of automated testing, a lot of things that you're not classically trained from the university or in a lot of jobs. And so it takes a lot to figure out, well, how do you even write testable code? Mm-hmm. So then you're bringing in other principles. One of my favorite principles of Solid is single responsibility, breaking those things down. And it just really, I've had comments from team members with, say, like sonar cube analysis and talking through like cognitive load, and it's over the number. And they're like, but I just broke it down into smaller functions. It's still the same count. I'm like, well, no, it's not, because, this idea of being able to read the code, which is something I've really tried to teach the teams over the years. Like, if you can read the code like a book, think about those naming conventions for your variables and your functions. And then all of a sudden, if you don't care about how the function works, you win. Mm-hmm. You win. And so it's just a great journey we've been on our side on that one.
And how many developers do you support?
So in my group, there's about 7 of us full-time FTEs, which is almost half the size of what it used to be about 5 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have some applications where you're happy with the way it's done, and some of the older applications. So for the listeners here who are all manual, they're looking from the outside in, they're like, man, I'd love to do this, but I just don't even know how to start. It's kind of hard to boil the ocean. You can't do everything at once. You haven't done it before. Where have you found it to work to start the DevOps journey?
Oh, man. That's a really good question. I mean, we're pretty unique. I shouldn't say I don't think we're too unique, but we're unique in the sense that being that we aren't writing a product that has a million lines of code, we end up with around, in our current DevOps situation, around over 100 applications. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of them are small, especially compared to a lot of industry. So I would generally say if there's a smaller application, you can go after it. If you had a console application versus a full-blown web application or something like that, start there. Start at that one. I think one of the things you can do is, while Azure DevOps or Jenkins or any of those other environments, just because you do them doesn't mean you're actually getting all the benefits of what true CI/CD is. It's a great start. Start looking at a build script. See if you can get that going. See if the whole team can run it. Because that's one of the things we discovered as we went on, is that how it compiles on the server can surprise you. When the team is grappling with trying to learn all those things, that's one less thing you want to have happen, is that the server is acting differently, the compile server, the CI server, that is, than your local machine. Which, if you're in the world of .NET and Visual Studio, it's actually very easy for that to happen, because Visual Studio abstracts a lot of MS Build from you. Mm-hmm. And that's great. The F5 is a powerful tool, but it abstracts a lot of things from you that build servers don't.
I think that's a good point to start with a small application, because you have fewer dependencies and smaller. It's not this big hairy beast that you can't make a lot of progress on. Now, you mentioned build script. All of the CI tools and build tools out there, they have tutorials where you click, boom, now you're, quote, continuous integration. Give us a rundown. What is a build script? Why is it important? And what, in your opinion, are the most important components that need to be in the build script?
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
Build script, in the basic of what I can describe is something that can be ran locally on your machine, the same as it would on the server, and it's there to compile the application. It should contain the ability for your local developer to run the application the way they need to. That might be standing up a local database. If you're using the Entity Framework or any of these other tools, Code First with, say, Code First, or if you're using Roundhouse or some of these other tools to define your database. So then you're going to run that locally. It'll build your database for you, maybe put that test data in there that you want. And that allows the developer to have that same experience locally. And then it has maybe an extra step or two for actually running tests. And you can choose to run them locally. Should, obviously, every time you're making changes. But that's all going to get executed on your integration server as well. And maybe further steps if you're going down the release pipeline, if you're going to deploy something out to an actual development environment that'll run further tests for you before it maybe goes to a human being for testing. And the key factor of that build script is that how it builds locally is exactly how it builds in the CI environment. That is the number one key, in my opinion, from the idea of CI with the build script. Because when you drag and drop, and you're right, it's one of the things that I've had to help educate over the years is you're right, drag and drop. YAML, not as drag and drop, but still the same concept in Azure DevOps or Jenkins. They've all got them. They've all got them. Is that you can't guarantee what you just dragged and dropped in the server is exactly how it's going. And for me, the biggest one on the build scripts, especially, at least I think a lot of .NET developers would fall into this category, is unless they've really understood the CS proj, which is the MS build kind of construct, the instructions for MS build. If you've never really dove into that, then the F5, the compile steps in Visual Studio are very magic. And for example, how MS Build builds outside of Visual Studio can be different than how Visual Studio ran it. And so again, that build script really protects you from that. One of the things that I do in our build scripts is that there's kind of a place where we put it in a root artifacts folder so that you can troubleshoot if something's happening on the server, bring it back down locally, run everything locally, and see what the results you get and troubleshoot from there. It's just, I found that while it takes an investment to get that going, you have one project, maybe not a big deal, although, if it's a huge project, it probably could be a big deal. But in our team, the problem is that because we have so many applications, and no any one developer can actually even know all the applications. What happens is it's easy to fall for the allure, the ease of the F5, the ease of the wizard in Azure DevOps or something like that to get something going. And so I've helped automate our entire pipeline process to go out to production day zero, so that the developers don't have to.
That's a big concept, day zero. So this is creating a new application. If you say, okay, hey, we need to create something new, and before we start just jamming on feature code, you want to make sure we have the capability to have the entire environment all the way to production. So talk about that definition, your standard now, when creating a new application, and you say, okay, go all the way to production, that the entire chain. What are the items that you like to make sure are in the DevOps environment when developers are starting a new application?
It's DevOps and the local environment. So we've written PowerShell script was original, and actually now we're moving it into the .NET templates that Microsoft has. I think around 3.1 days is when they were coming out with that. Very powerful, and then we add to that. So from day one, I have a repo that they download and run, and basically it says, "Hey, I need a new web app, or I need a new console app." That's basically our two kinds of apps. And then it locks in everything from, say, a console app. It creates a local repository. It protects main, even on the local. We have basically a warning message that we put in a Git hook that says, "Hey, you shouldn't be directly hitting on main," because right now in our teams we're doing pull requests. I personally would love to get away from PRs, but that's okay until we have a team of teams really working together 24/7. PRs is where we are. So it's a nice little protection mechanism, and that happens there. It happens locally. It sets up, the git ignore. It sets up all those things from day one. It sets up the solution structure, the way we've described how we want our solution structure. We have a lib folder. We have a source folder. We have a test folder for the test projects and those kinds of things. And it sounds tiny, but when you don't have that and you need to do something with a lot of applications and you need to automate, which I've had to do over the years, it's a pain. It's a nightmare when you can't get that standard. Then what it does is that it brings in a YAML file for our build side. So our builds are completely YAML. And then our releases are still classic. We still use the GUI, mainly because there's features we're begging Microsoft to add. One of our biggest problems is the business hours, but I digress. So it will build. It'll even kick off that build. It'll even then clone a representative release for the environment, because we have about 60 servers comprising about 12 environments. And then it spot changes things. It goes and grabs the GUIDs that it needs out of Azure DevOps through Azure API calls and changes the cloned value for us, so that the team member doesn't have to do anything. So day zero, it's out the door. And that works for quite a few of our environments. Some of our environments aren't perfectly day zero yet. We're not allowed to touch DNS. I guess I can understand that bit because we're still highly on-premise. I want to clarify that too. We're still highly on-premise. Our cloud journey is really just now getting underway. And we haven't really figured out what that means. But I plan on doing the same kind of idea in the cloud, day zero deployments using, Bicep or something like that, to get that out the door, get those things so that the developers can't make a mistake. They aren't asking questions, looking up the documentation about how it should be. And let's be honest, they need to get to the code. And so I've been a huge proponent. Day zero, hello world. No line of code, and hello world is out there if it's a web app or if it's a console app, and it's delivered to the server that it's going to be living on.
So these are existing VM servers, or are they all IIS typically?
Yep. Okay. We're still almost 100% IIS.
So when you talk about environment, creating a new web application in an existing IIS is effectively creating a new environment.
Yes. So in my release pipelines, we leverage the IIS to describe the application installation and configuration, the web app pool, all of that stuff, even file shares. If there's a file share or something like that, we then script that. We will do a PowerShell script, for example, to set up a file share if it's on that server. And I like that because it's idempotent. It's the idea that, I should be able tomorrow, if we lost all of our servers on that environment, that then the infrastructure team could say, here's your new VMs. And we just, we put the environment agent on them and go. And so that's a big goal of ours. Our servers do have like infrastructure as code on them, but we made the decision years ago didn't make sense to us to update the infrastructure of each application coming on in that infra as code. So we said, we'll do that part in DevOps, and we'll see where the future goes. We've talked about containers. We've talked about all those things, but there's a lot of capabilities as we move into Azure that we haven't explored yet. But yes, on-prem shared IIS web servers, some servers host only 2 or 3 applications because of their criticality or their data protection requirements. Some of them have 20, 30, 40 applications on them.
Mm-hmm. Some people like to talk about the new and interesting cloud native services and all the new resources that you can use in Azure, all the latest stuff and the latest new tech and containers. And then I find out that they have manual outage windows, and they're running command lines with by typing or copying and pasting to do a deploy, and versus tons of applications that are out there that have environments that have been around for a long time before really the latest version of Azure was even around. And I would even say that this statement is probably true, even if you were modifying some of the COBOL code you mentioned and deploying to a COBOL environment, that an automated quick cycle process is probably more valuable than using the absolute latest version of every type of tech. What's your opinion on that?
Oh, 100%. One of the things I've been trying to really break the cycle of habit around here was that idea of all the way to the code, short iterations, get them out the door. And it's the same with the servers, as far as I'm concerned, or your releases, I should say. It's so critical to get value out the door. It's so critical to also be able to, with our Azure DevOps releases, most of the time, if something does go wrong, which right now we have pretty low failure rates, if they're short, the idea of roll forward becomes trivially easy to troubleshoot. Rollbacks are dangerous. Almost always rollbacks usually entail some kind of restore at the database and other things. And now it's more hands, and it's just a lot of things like that. So one thing I've tried hard is to teach the teams, think about how you can break down the features down to less than a day's worth of work, get them out the door. Even if they're incomplete, can you put them behind feature flags or branch by abstraction kind of thought processes? It is funny though, because it is so hard until you have that eureka moment yourself. All you see is more code. All you see is that's taking me more time. But when my team members, and I've had several of them come to me over the years to be like, now I get it. It's finally, yes, that's awesome. I'm so excited. And for anybody in a position where they're leading like that, I think it just takes patience. It takes a lot of time. It's better to slowly keep working the organization that way instead of demanding and forcing. And the same thing with feature flags. And actually, roll forward, roll back was a great argument here for years with our change management team, our CAB, that we still have available here. So our change advisory board. Initially, a gentleman who was on that team absolutely was like, no way, you are not rolling forward. You will not roll forward. That's not how this works. You roll back. And it just takes time to educate as to why roll forward was a better way. And for the most part, we're there now. We do roll forwards when we do have an issue. I would say 99% of the time. So you couldn't do that if you developed for 3 months, or the infrastructure took 3 months to put together. And the day you go live, everybody's turning everything on. And years ago, that was a thing. It could take a ticket for months to get your IIS ready to go. And then you deploy to prod because you've already done dev and test for the last 2 months. Then you deploy to prod and you discover something's wrong with the IIS configuration. And when I say you figure it out, usually takes hours of troubleshooting with the system administration team, right? Because, I made a mistake when I wrote that thing in the incident ticket that I put to you, you misunderstood. And so with DevOps, being able to get out the door fast, and if you have to roll forward, great, which is our thing. We do here we practice release branches so that it is easy to roll back if we need to. And generally speaking, we don't.
Okay. Now, what kind of dependencies do you guys deal with? I'm guessing you have some various databases and file shares and third-party systems to call web services or messages. But when you think about only roll forward, what have you had to do specifically with the dependencies in your architecture to even make that possible?
I'll put it this way, from a lot of that aspect, where the most work that we've had to do is on the database level. And so,
is that SQL Server, Postgres?
Well, it actually, for us, it's generally SQL Server, but we also have Oracle.
Okay.
And depending on the project, there might actually be changes to our PeopleSoft system that's Oracle underneath the hood.
Okay.
But in our world, at least in SQL Server, like if it's our database, and I say as in the custom developer team's database, what we have been kind of preaching over the years is safe database deployment, safe database changes. There's books out on it. And that idea of like, you don't drop that column the day you're going out. You don't, if a column changes from one kind of data point to another, you bring in the second one, you do a data conversion, you leave the old one. And even in code, you leave the old and new. And so because if you get rid of it, there is no easy way backwards to say roll back.
It's a backup restore.
And so now, if I could say it this way, that's where the roll forward becomes a requirement, except it was a requirement because you didn't do your homework, if I could say it that way. And that's not where you want to be. That's not at all where you want to be. But with the roll forward idea, even though we do safe database deployments, and I try to preach that and teach that to the team members, the big one there for us is the biggest thing I've ever taught about making that possible is don't do big bang deployments. If you've been coding for 3 months, 6 months, and it goes out the door, now reasoning about the problem is a lot bigger. It's nigh impossible to figure out in a time frame to be able to roll forward quickly, if you could say it that way. That would be my biggest thing, is the idea of the database, and then thinking about the concepts of how can you write code with, say, like feature flags and other things where you can actually deploy to production. And yet it's we've done this too, where you deploy to production, it's out there for a few users. You turn it on more, maybe you discover something, you turn the feature off, and they're just using the old version. And that's another powerful concept that I've worked with even people above, outside of my team, like the change management team, to say, here's techniques you can do that actually lower the risk. And that's the whole thing of a change management process, is you're concerned about risk, especially high risk. And so touting that to my team members, but that's been the biggest key in my team's journey, is realizing, that's more code. It's more code. And it sometimes doesn't feel worth it until you have that seminal maybe mistake or bug get out the door, and you turn it off and you're like, that was awesome. That was great. And so that's what I've seen. Much less about the third-party services, because if you're doing a web API, unless you're making changes with that vendor, and if you're making changes with that vendor, I will admit, at least for us here, a lot of times you're beholden to how the vendor wants to do things a lot of times. And so you just make the best of that. There's techniques to protect against API changes, but in this case, most of the time, if it's third-party vendor, it's more lockstep kind of project, process, and good dev test environments for that.
Okay. So last question before we go, you mentioned feature flags a few times. What is your chosen practice for introducing, using, toggling, and then maybe deprecating that? And what are your favorite tools and libraries for those feature flags?
Well, we're not using any tools out of the box, because again, most of our applications are small enough that, our simple if statement with web config or app setting is good enough for us. And so that's what we do.
Do you have a naming convention that you like?
We don't push a lot of naming conventions when we get down to that code level, but when it comes to Booleans, I try to tell people, write that, Boolean, if you will, if it's a Boolean on-off kind of thing, write it as is on, is whatever on, is whatever off, that kind of statement. And that's very, very generic. As far as removing it, I've told them really the best practice for us is give it a few iterations after you've gone live, and then go ahead and remove it. because that is one of the downsides of feature flags or toggles, especially if you have a lot of them, is when do you deprecate them? And that's a maintenance effort. If we were using them, if the team discovered, I think, that they were using them a lot and it was becoming problematic, I would probably start to look at a third-party vendor. I mean, I know there's the Microsoft ASP.NET Azure configuration. Oh, what is it called? That's built into that.
And it's just called Azure Feature Flags?
I think might be. I know when they first came out, if I remember right, you had to be using the Azure configuration, and we weren't on Azure. Don't know if it's changed since then, but there's plenty of great vendors out there, but I just don't see that we'll have to go there on that.
It's called Feature Manager. That's what it's
Feature
called.
Manager. There you go. Yeah. And it does have things that we don't do. I mean, most of our feature flags are simple. We pick a list of users that it goes to or something like that. It has a lot more capabilities than that. And I certainly, one thing I've known about my career is I tended to work for small organizations, small groups, writing small apps compared to industry, not writing applications that are being sold to millions of customers out there. So I've been very cognizant to that I have a different worldview when it comes to software development that's very crafted around that would not work for the Netflix, would not work for the Amazons. And so actually, I think a lot of times that's an advantage because it allows you to do things a little more nimbly, but at the same time, maybe not as exciting.
Oh, it's always exciting in the software world. Awesome. Hey, well, man, this has been good. Thank you for sharing about how you've led your teams through your DevOps maturity journey. A lot of work and probably a lot of years just to kind of get that progress. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing with us.
Thank you for inviting me. Hopefully your listeners will be delighted.
Oh, I'm sure they will. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.